Yo, what is up guys, Ghost here, welcome back to Stormgate Central. So today, with the upcoming free-to-play week for Stormgate in February, I thought we'd take a look at some of the major differences between the two factions of the game, the Vanguard and the Infernals, so that you guys can see how they differ and perhaps make up your mind on which one is the right one for you. So for this video, I really want to focus on the core building mechanics, production mechanics and other core features of each faction that really set them apart not only from one another, but from other RTS games that you may have already played. We are going to be delving quite deep into these mechanics here and how they can affect the game. This is not going to be a super quick overview, so grab yourself a drink, pull up a chair, and let's get cracking. As always though guys, if you do enjoy the content here on the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We will be covering all of the Stormgate news leading up to release, and once the Steam Next Fest begins, you will see some guides here on the channel, as well as hopefully some really high level matches between the top players in the beta. So thank you guys as always so much for your support. So let's just jump straight in here, starting with the building mechanics. So the worker unit for the Vanguard is called a Bob, and for the most part these guys act like any other worker. However, you can actually use multiple Bobs to build a single structure, which is known as power building. Now this really opens up a lot of interesting opportunities for the Vanguard faction. Fast expansions, for example, become much more viable since you can now power build your command post. If you forget to build a habitat, which is the supply building for the faction, it's not really a big deal because now you can just power build one super fast with multiple Bobs. Proxy barracks rushes, sentry post rushes, etc. All of these things are more scary now because of this ability to build things faster. Now, building with more than one Bob, it does come at a cost, and the cost is obviously that you aren't mining as much luminite or as much therium, and you've got to pull those workers off of your resources in order to build. And for each Bob that you add to build a structure, it isn't a 100% increase on the build time. So if we say that one Bob building a structure is a 100% build time, if you add a second Bob, it's more like 150%. Add a third Bob, around 180%, and a fourth Bob gets you to maybe 200%, and then you have the double build speed. These numbers aren't entirely accurate, but you get the idea, right? Diminishing returns. So if you can avoid power building, that is always going to be the more economical route, and it's just something that you want to keep in mind. Now, in addition to building, just like SCVs, Bobs can also repair mechanical units, which is very handy for early game rushes, both offensive and defensive. The first unit you get for the Vanguard, the Scout, is actually a mechanical unit as well, so you can repair those with your Bobs in the early game. Then the command post actually has a very useful ability called Bob Overcharge, and what this does is it greatly increases the defense of your Bobs around the command post for a short time, often allowing you to completely shut down run-bys from enemy scouts or fiends. Another cool building mechanic the Vanguard have is they've got the ability to salvage any building for 100% of the cost. So think proxy barracks rushes. Once you've denied that fast expansion or whatever your goal is, you can salvage your barracks, you can salvage your sentry post, and then transition into a macro game without really losing out on any resources. So that's pretty cool. Now let's shift gears here and let's talk about the Infernals worker unit, the Imp. So the Imps build units very similarly to Zerg from StarCraft, namely because they sacrifice themselves to summon a structure. So once you've built that structure, that Imp is gone, and you're going to have to build another one. So with this faction, if you do get supply block, for example, there is no quick way to build a meat farm, which is the supply building for the Infernals. You just have to wait out that duration. It's not like the Vanguard where they can power build a habitat and get back up and running again. You're just going to have to wait it out. Now, Imps cannot repair or heal anything either, and they have no defensive ability right off the bat to combat harassment. However, the Infernal meat farms double not just as a supply building, but also as a defensive structure by spawning these little fell hogs that will automatically attack enemy units. Now, these fell hogs cannot be controlled, so it's a common tactic to actually see Infernal players place their first meat farm pretty close to their luminite mine to protect their workers. And then later on in games, you will see them mixed in between Shroudstones to sort of form like a front line or a bit of a blockade. Now later on in the mid to late game, you can actually unlock an ability for the imps called Flame On, and what it does is it sets fire to the imp and lets it kamikaze itself into the enemy, so kind of like a Baneling. Once you've activated the Flame On ability, it cannot be cancelled, that imp is going to blow up, and if you don't hit the enemy in time, well then you've just wasted it. Okay, so that covers production and workers, and I would say that the Vanguard definitely have an advantage in that regard with their power building and also their salvage ability. But now let's talk about unit production, which is definitely an area where the Infernals, I think they set themselves apart from the competition. So the Vanguard are pretty simple, pretty straightforward. They build units just like any other RTS. You queue up a unit, the resources are deducted from your account, let's say, and you have to wait out the build time. For the Infernals, you don't actually build units. You summon them in from a distant world pretty much instantaneously, and there is then a cooldown on your summoning charges. So each production building can hold 3 of these summoning charges at a time, which makes macroing as this faction a little bit more similar to the Zerg from StarCraft, I would say. If you get supply block, for example, whilst you are going to have to wait for that meat farm to build, you can still accrue these summoning charges, build a meat farm, and then once the meat farm has finished and you're back up with your supply, well then you can instantly pump out the units once you have that supply, not really losing any units or any macroing time in the process. You can also afford to bank more resources and summoning charges and sort of see what situation arises. You know, if the enemy is going to make a big push across the map, okay, it's time to spend those resources and charges on getting out some units. If not, well, maybe you want to build a bunch of imps from your shrine structures to saturate that third expansion. Definitely feels a lot more Zergy, but, you know, with its own little twist. Okay, moving on, let's talk about Shroud. So Shroud is this dark, swirling, magical fog that you see all over the ground, and it's generated by 2 buildings. The Shrine, which is your starting building that builds the worker imps, and then your defensive structure for this faction, the Shroudstone. Now the Shroud will give any of your units essentially a shield or an extra white health bar that only charges up whilst they're on the Shroud. So this is an incredibly powerful defensive boon for your army, but at the same time, it can be rather crippling because as soon as you move your units off of the Shroud, that white health bar will begin to decay. Now the Infernals do not have many fast-moving units except for the Fiends, so for example in Infernal mirror matchups, whoever decides to attack is at a pretty major disadvantage because they will have lost a lot of white health moving their army all that way across the map, whilst the guy sat at home on the other side, well, he'll just be defending and he's going to have full white health. So the name of the game here is spreading your Shroud across your base and expansions with Shroudstones, the same way that you would with Creep as the Zerg, and even building Shroudstones in forward positions so that you can set up an attack closer to your enemy's base. I will note here that unlike the Zerg, you can build as the Infernals anywhere on the map. You do not have to build on Shroud, it just benefits your army greatly. The Infernals also have a flying transport unit called the Doombringer that we actually saw Mana use in this show match here against TLO, and as you can see, it does produce a temporary Shroud field wherever it's deployed. Now on the other end of the spectrum here, we have the Veterancy bonus for the Vanguard. So the cool thing about the Vanguard in contrast is that they are basically just free to roam around the map and their units will always perform the same wherever they are. So you will see this faction generally being more aggressive early on, taking more of the creep camps, etc. And the more units they kill, the more they will rank up via their Veterancy bonus. And this bonus, depending on the level of rank, increases the health of that unit permanently. Now, finally here, let's talk about defensive structures and abilities for each faction, beginning with the Vanguard. So their defensive structure is called the Sentry Post, and what it does is it changes form depending on which unit you put inside. If you place a bob inside, it becomes an automatic repair bay for mechanical units. If you place a scout there, it becomes like a sentry tower. If you put in a lancer, it has this circular saw that spins and sort of ricochets, hitting multiple units at a time. If you put in an exo, it becomes a long-range cannon, and if you put in a medtech, I believe it actually heals nearby biological units. So that is a very cool building right there. On the Infernal side, as I already mentioned, they have these Shroudstones, and the Shroudstones have a laser beam attack, and they also create Shroud. But that isn't all they do. They also store this energy called Animus, and the Shroudstones gather this energy from fallen enemies. So the more you engage with your enemies, the more engagements you have, the more of this Animus you will gather, and you can then use this energy with your Shroudstones to unleash a ritual. Now, I believe there are 3 rituals in the game. One of them increases the range and the reach of your Shroud temporarily. The second one is a mass infest ability. So just to explain briefly here what infest is, the Infernals have a ranged unit called the Gaunt, and the Gaunt gets an upgrade that allows them to infest enemy biological units that will do damage over time, and when an infested unit dies, it will spawn a fiend. So what this ritual does is it's a mass infest that can be extremely powerful, especially when you don't have Gaunts with the upgrade. That means you still have access to the infestability via this ritual. And the final ability allows you to summon the Flayed Dragon, the most powerful unit in the Infernals arsenal. Now, as for the third faction of Stormgate, who knows what that will entail since it is yet to be announced, but I think it's likely to be similar to the Protoss in the sense that it'll have fewer units, but more powerful units. So I think the Vanguard, they are definitely like the baseline for the game in terms of unit numbers and power. The Infernals, they have a greater number of units, but generally a little bit less power, and so that makes me think that the third faction will swing in the opposite direction, but you know, I suppose time will tell. Guys, the Steam Next Fest is fast approaching, so let me know in the comments what sort of content you would like to see from me here on the channel. Do you want to see more guides? Do you want to see pro-level games, world lore? You know, just let me know what interests you. If you guys missed this video the other day going over all of the details on the upcoming open beta for the Steam Next Fest, go and check that one out. But otherwise, I will see you all in the next video.